What if everything you thought you wanted turned out to be empty? In the distance between us, Daniel Morgan, a successful businessman, has it all: money, power, and a life of luxury. But when he learns that Samantha, the woman he once loved, has died, he's thrown into a whirlwind of emotions. Then comes the real shock: Samantha had a son, and that boy, Ethan, might be Daniel's. As Daniel seeks the truth, he's forced to confront his past mistakes and question the choices that led him away from the family he never knew he had. Will he be able to build a bond with Ethan and find redemption? Or is it too late? Stay tuned to find out, and don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Let me know in the comments. What would you do if you found out you had a child you never knew about? Daniel Morgan stared out of his penthouse office. The entire New York City skyline spread before him like a kingdom he had conquered. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the glass buildings and busy streets below. But inside, Daniel's office was silent. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the weight of his success pressing down on him harder than ever. The office, with its sleek minimalist design, held no comfort. The abstract art on the walls, the custom-made desk, the meticulously placed awards, they were symbols of a life built on control and ambition. Yet they felt hollow. Daniel had spent over 2 decades climbing to the top, building Morgan Enterprises into one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. To everyone who knew him, he was a man who had it all: wealth, power, influence. His name alone opened doors most people could only dream of. But today, as he looked out at the city, all he could feel was emptiness. A gnawing sense of dissatisfaction had been creeping in lately, but he didn't understand why. He had always thought that reaching the pinnacle of success would be enough. The only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, a subtle reminder of the time slipping away. It was odd for Daniel to even notice the clock usually. His days were so packed with meetings and calls that he barely had time to think. Today, however, something felt different. His eyes lingered on the skyline, but his thoughts were far away, drifting back to a time before his rise to power, before he had shut out the world and focused solely on his career. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. It was an email from Nathaniel Cross, an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. Nathaniel was one of the few people who had known Daniel before he became the man everyone else saw now: before the money, before the empire. Daniel hesitated before opening the message. Something about it felt ominous. "Daniel, I just heard about Samantha. I thought you should know she passed away a few weeks ago. I'm sorry." The words seemed to freeze in the air. Daniel's hand tightened around the phone, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Samantha passed away. Those words didn't belong together. Not his Samantha, the woman who had once meant more to him than anyone else in the world. He reread the message, hoping it would make more sense the second time, but the words remained the same. Samantha, the love of his life, was gone. Just like that. He hadn't spoken to her in years, hadn't even thought about her recently. Life had gotten in the way. His career had taken over everything. But now, the memory of her hit him like a train. How had this happened? Why hadn't he known? Guilt crept in quickly. He had cut her off, shut her out when his career demanded everything from him. They had parted on uncertain terms, but he had never stopped caring for her. He had convinced himself that walking away was the right thing to do, that focusing on his business was what he needed to succeed. And now she was gone. Daniel sat there, stunned, for what felt like an eternity. The ticking clock filled the room, louder now, almost mocking him. It reminded him that time, once lost, could never be reclaimed. He had always been able to control the trajectory of his life, but Samantha's death was a stark reminder that there were things he couldn't control. She was gone, and he hadn't even known. Suddenly, the walls of his office felt suffocating. The silence, once a comfort, now pressed in on him from all sides. He needed to get out, needed air. Without a second thought, he stood, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just left, something completely out of character for a man so driven by routine and order. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy taxes honking, people rushing by, the endless hum of a metropolis that never stopped moving. But Daniel felt disconnected from it all. He moved through the streets as if in a daze, his mind spinning with thoughts of Samantha. What had her life been like in the years since they'd parted? Had she been happy? Had she thought of him? His feet carried him to Central Park, a place he hadn't been in years. It was one of the few places in the city where life seemed to slow down. The trees were starting to turn, their leaves a mix of gold and red, a reminder that summer was fading. The crisp autumn air brushed against Daniel's face, waking him from his fog. He wandered through the park aimlessly, watching families play, couples stroll, and children laugh as they chased each other across the lawns. The sight of them, of people who still had their lives ahead of them, stirred something deep inside him, a longing he hadn't felt in years. It was a life he had never had. He had sacrificed personal relationships for success, telling himself it was worth it. But now, in the quiet of the park, surrounded by people who had what he didn't, he wasn't so sure anymore. Just as he was about to sit on a bench near the fountain, something caught his eye. A young boy, no more than 12, was sitting alone on a nearby bench, his head down, his shoulders shaking slightly. Daniel paused, his eyes fixed on the boy. He was clearly upset, though trying to hide it. Something about the boy's quiet grief resonated with Daniel. He had spent most of his life suppressing his own emotions, and now here he was, watching a child do the same. Daniel hesitated for a moment. Approaching a child he didn't know was out of character for him. He wasn't someone who got involved in other people's problems. He was the kind of man who maintained distance, who prided himself on emotional control. But something about this boy drew him in. He slowly made his way over to the bench and stood in front of the boy. "Hey," Daniel said softly, his voice gentler than he was used to. "You okay?" The boy looked up, startled, his eyes red from crying. He quickly wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket, trying to hide his tears. "I'm fine," he muttered, though it was clear he wasn't. Daniel sat down beside him, keeping a respectful distance. "Doesn't look like it," he said. "You sure you don't want to talk about it?" The boy was silent for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to trust this stranger. Finally, he shook his head but didn't leave. Daniel could sense that the boy was torn between wanting to be alone and needing someone to listen. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Ethan," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Daniel," he said, offering a small, comforting smile. "Nice to meet you, Ethan." Ethan glanced up at him, still unsure but slightly more at ease. There was something in Daniel's calm demeanor that seemed to put him at ease, even though he clearly didn't want to open up too much. "Why are you sitting here all alone?" Daniel asked gently. "Where's your family?" Ethan's face tightened, and his eyes filled with tears again. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. "My mom, she died a few weeks ago." Daniel felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He hadn't expected that. The weight of the boy's words hung heavy between them. "I'm really sorry to hear that, Ethan," Daniel said quietly, unsure of what else to say. Ethan sniffed and wiped his face again, though the tears continued to fall. "I don't know what to do anymore. She was all I had." Daniel looked away for a moment, the boy's pain hitting him harder than he had expected. He wasn't used to this. Wasn't used to feeling much of anything outside the controlled world of business deals and financial success. But something about Ethan stirred memories from long ago. Memories of a woman he had loved once before everything became so complicated. "I'm really sorry, Ethan," Daniel repeated, though he knew the words would do little to ease the boy's pain. "Do you have anyone else? Any other family?" Ethan shook his head. "No, my dad's gone. It's just me now." Daniel's heart clenched. He couldn't explain it, but a strange sense of responsibility washed over him. This boy was all alone in the world, just like he felt sometimes. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he felt compelled to help. "Where are you staying?" Daniel asked gently. "I'm with a friend of my mom's for now," Ethan said. "But it's not forever." Daniel nodded, though his mind was racing. He didn't know what to say. His entire life had been built on maintaining control. But here, with Ethan, he felt completely unmoored. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. After a few moments of silence, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded photograph. His hands shook slightly as he handed it to Daniel, This was her, he said quietly. Daniel took the photo, expecting to see a stranger's face. But when his eyes landed on the image, everything around him seemed to freeze. It was Samantha. Her face was older, softened by time, but there was no mistaking it. It was her, the woman he had loved and lost all those years ago. The woman he had never stopped thinking about, even though he had tried to bury the memories. And now, here she was, in a photograph held by a boy who claimed she was his mother. Daniel's mind raced. How could this be? He hadn't seen Samantha in over a decade. They had parted ways, thinking their lives were going in different directions. But she had never mentioned a child. Had she known she was pregnant when they separated? Had she tried to tell him? Daniel's hands trembled as he handed the photo back to Ethan. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Could Ethan be his son? Could Samantha have kept this from him? "How long ago did your mom pass away?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky. "A few weeks ago," Ethan replied. "She got sick fast." There wasn't much time. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had been living his life, consumed by meetings and profits, while Samantha had been fighting for hers and he hadn't even known. Not a single call. Not a letter. She had slipped away without him realizing it. "She never talked about your dad?" Daniel asked cautiously, afraid of what the answer might be. Ethan shrugged, oblivious to the storm of emotions raging inside Daniel. "She said he was someone important to her, but they couldn't be together. I guess he didn't want to be around." Daniel's stomach turned. Was that how Samantha had remembered him? As someone who didn't want to be around? He had no idea she had been pregnant when they parted. If he had known. He looked at Ethan, really looked at him this time. There was something familiar in the boy's face, something that reminded him of Samantha, but also of himself. Daniel couldn't speak. His throat tightened with the weight of the revelation, and all he could do was sit there, staring at the boy who had unknowingly just turned his world upside down. After a few moments, Daniel stood, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He had to get away, had to think. He mumbled an apology to Ethan and hurried out of the park, his heart racing. As he walked back to his penthouse, the world around him blurred. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Samantha and Ethan. How had he missed this? How had he let Samantha slip away without ever knowing the truth? When he reached his apartment, he sank into the couch, staring out at the city skyline. The view, which had once made him feel powerful and in control, now seemed distant, unreal. Samantha had a son, and that son might be his. Daniel knew one thing for certain: he needed answers. He needed to know the truth, not just for himself, but for Ethan. Morning, Daniel's apartment. Daniel didn't sleep that night. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Ethan, the photograph of Samantha, and the nagging feeling that he had missed something crucial. He was up before the sun, pacing the length of his penthouse living room, staring at his phone. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could help him get them. Daniel called Greg Miles, the private investigator he'd used in the past for business matters. Greg was thorough, discreet, and didn't ask too many questions. When Greg picked up, Daniel wasted no time. "I need you to look into someone," Daniel said, his voice tense. "Her name is Samantha, or was. She passed away a few weeks ago, but I need to know everything about her life before then. And Greg, this isn't business. This is personal." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Greg spoke. "I'll get on it right away. Give me a few days." Daniel hung up and stared out the window. The city below was waking up, oblivious to the storm brewing in his life. He had always been able to control his world, but now, for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. The hours passed slowly. Daniel tried to focus on work, attending meetings and answering emails, but his mind kept drifting back to Samantha, to Ethan. How had he been so disconnected from her life that he didn't even know she had a son? Worse, that she had died without him ever realizing. The more Daniel thought about it, the more the guilt consumed him. He had thrown himself into his career, convinced that success was the only thing that mattered. But now, standing on the other side of that success, he wasn't so sure anymore. What had he lost along the way? What had it all been for? 3 days later, Greg called with the report. Daniel picked up the phone, his heart pounding. "I've got what you asked for," Greg said, his voice steady. "It's not pretty, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Go on. Samantha did reach out to you multiple times, Greg said. But her messages never got through. It looks like she tried to call you a few years ago, even sent a couple of letters. They were intercepted by your assistant, a guy named Frank Hall. He thought they were personal distractions, so he disposed of them. Daniel's mind reeled. Frank, his assistant at the time, had shielded him from anything that might take his focus away from work. Daniel had encouraged it. He had wanted to be efficient, to cut out any distractions. And now, because of that, he had missed the chance to reconnect with Samantha. I also found out she was struggling financially after you two split, Greg continued. She worked a few different jobs, none of them stable. She raised Ethan on her own, no help from anyone. She never married. Daniel gripped the phone tighter. Samantha had been alone, struggling, while he had been building an empire. She had tried to reach him, and he had been too focused on his career to notice. His stomach churned with guilt. There's more, Greg said. She was diagnosed with cancer about 6 months ago. By the time she found out, it was already too late. She didn't have anyone to turn to except a friend of hers, a woman named Karen Jensen. Ethan's staying with her now, but it's temporary. Daniel's chest tightened. Samantha had died without him even knowing she was sick. He hadn't been there for her, and now Ethan was left with no one. Thanks, Greg, Daniel said, his voice strained. Send me everything you've got. Central Park. Late afternoon. With Greg's report weighing heavily on his mind, Daniel knew he had to talk to Ethan again. He had been hesitant before, unsure of how to approach the boy, but now he felt a sense of urgency. Ethan deserved to know the truth, and Daniel needed to know if Ethan was his son. Daniel returned to Central Park the next afternoon, hoping to find Ethan in the same spot near the fountain. As he walked through the park, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread in his chest. What if Ethan didn't want to see him again? What if the boy rejected him outright? When Daniel finally spotted Ethan sitting on the bench, his heart leapt in his chest. The boy was scribbling something in a notebook, lost in thought. Daniel approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. Ethan, Daniel said softly, sitting down beside him. Ethan looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He didn't say anything, but he didn't get up to leave either. I've been thinking a lot since we last talked, Daniel said, keeping his voice calm. About your mom. About you. Ethan stared at him, his expression guarded. Why do you care so much? He asked. You didn't even know her anymore. The words stung, but Daniel knew they were justified. You're right, Daniel admitted. I didn't know her as well as I should have. We lost touch, but I cared about her. I always cared. Ethan was silent, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't seem convinced, but he wasn't pushing Daniel away either. Your mom and I were close a long time ago, Daniel continued. We went our separate ways. But I didn't know she had a son. I didn't know about you, Ethan. If I had... Ethan's face darkened, and Daniel could see the anger building behind the boy's eyes. If you had known, what Ethan snapped. You would have been around, you would have helped us because you weren't. You didn't. Emotional pull. Ethan's words hit Daniel hard. The boy's anger was justified, and Daniel knew it. He had been absent, oblivious to the life Samantha had been living without him. But now, he had a chance to make it right if Ethan would let him. I know I wasn't there when I should have been, Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. And I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I want to help. I want to be part of your life, Ethan, if you'll let me. Ethan didn't respond right away. He stared at the ground, his fists clenched in his lap. It's too late for that, he muttered. Maybe, Daniel said softly, but that doesn't mean I'm going to give up. Not on you. Ethan's eyes flickered with something a mix of anger, pain, and confusion. He didn't say anything, but Daniel could tell the boy was struggling to process everything. After a long silence, Ethan finally spoke. Why didn't my mom ever talk about you? Daniel swallowed hard. I don't know, he admitted, but I'd like to find out. Karen Jensen's apartment. Early evening. Over the next few days, Daniel and Ethan continued to meet in the park. Their conversations were stilted, tense at times, but slowly they were starting to build a fragile connection. Ethan was still wary of Daniel, unsure if he could trust the man who had been absent for so long. But Daniel was patient. He knew he had to earn Ethan's trust, and that would take time. One afternoon, Ethan mentioned something that piqued Daniel's curiosity. "My mom had this box," Ethan said, his voice hesitant. "She kept it in the closet, and sometimes she'd take it out and look through it when she thought I wasn't around. I think it had stuff from when she was younger. Before I was born." Daniel's heart raced. Could the box contain something that explained why Samantha had never told him about Ethan? Could it hold letters, photos, anything that might give him the answers he was searching for? "Do you think I could see it?" Daniel asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard. "Maybe it could help us understand more about your mom's life." Ethan shrugged, though he seemed unsure. "I guess. It's at the apartment where Im's staying with Karen." Daniel nodded. "If you're okay with it, I'd like to take a look." Later that evening, they went to Karen Jensen's apartment, a modest place filled with warmth despite its small size. Karen was a kind woman in her early 40s, with a soft, empathetic voice. She greeted Daniel politely, but her protective gaze lingered on Ethan, as if she wasn't sure what to make of Daniel's sudden presence in the boy's life. Ethan retrieved the box from the back of the closet. It was a small wooden chest, worn from years of use. He placed it on the coffee table, his fingers hovering over the lid. "You sure you want to do this?" Ethan asked, glancing at Daniel. Daniel nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Yeah, I'm ready." Ethan slowly opened the box, revealing a collection of old letters, photographs, and small trinkets. Daniel's eyes scanned the contents, searching for anything that might explain why Samantha had kept Ethan a secret. Among the letters was a bundle tied with a ribbon. Daniel reached for it, his hands trembling slightly as he untied the knot. The paper was old, the handwriting instantly recognizable. It was Samantha's. As Daniel unfolded the first letter, his breath caught in his throat. It was addressed to him. Samantha had written it after they parted ways, but had never sent it. As Daniel read, his heart pounded. She had written about her regrets, about how much she had missed him, how hard it had been to raise Ethan alone. But the words that hit Daniel the hardest came near the end of the letter. "I tried to find you, Daniel. I thought I could raise Ethan on my own, but I was wrong. He needs you. We need you. I don't know how to reach you anymore, but I have to try." Late night. Daniel's apartment. Daniel sat at his dining table, the letter from Samantha spread out in front of him. His hands still trembled as he traced the faded ink, his mind racing with guilt and regret. She had tried to find him. She had wanted him to know about Ethan, but she hadn't been able to reach him. If only he had paid more attention. If only he hadn't been so wrapped up in his career. Samantha had needed him, and he hadn't been there. As the night wore on, Daniel couldn't shake the weight of the revelation. Ethan was his son. He had to be. There was no other explanation. But the only way to be sure was to take a DNA test. Central Park, afternoon. The next day, Daniel met Ethan in the park again, his mind made up. He had to know the truth, for both of their sakes. "I need to talk to you about something important," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes wary. "What?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I think there's a chance that I might be your father." Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment he just stared at Daniel in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Daniel explained everything. The letter, the timeline, the connection between him and Samantha. He told Ethan that the only way to be sure was to take a DNA test. Ethan's face darkened. "You think you might be my dad?" His voice cracked with anger. "Why didn't you know? Why didn't she tell you?" Daniel's heart ached as he watched the pain and confusion in Ethan's eyes. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to know for sure. I want to be here for you, Ethan. If I'm your father, I want to help." Ethan didn't respond right away. His fists clenched tightly in his lap, and Daniel could see the boy was struggling with the weight of the revelation. After a long silence, Ethan finally nodded. "Okay, I'll take the test." Clinic, early morning. The DNA test was simple, a quick swab of the cheek, but the emotional toll was much heavier. Daniel watched as the nurse performed the test on Ethan, the boy sitting stiffly in the chair, his eyes focused on the floor. Daniel had never felt so helpless. He had built his life around control, around certainty, but now everything was out of his hands. All he could do was wait for the results. The waiting was excruciating. Days passed, each one stretching on endlessly. Daniel tried to keep himself busy with work, but his thoughts always drifted back to Ethan, to Samantha, to the life he had missed out on. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart leapt in his chest, only to fall again when it wasn't the message he was waiting for. Ethan, too, was struggling. He barely spoke to Daniel during their brief meetings, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He didn't know how to feel about the possibility that Daniel might be his father. Part of him wanted it to be true, to finally have someone in his life who cared. But another part of him was terrified of being hurt, of being abandoned again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the results came in. Daniel received the email while sitting at his desk. His hand shook as he opened it, scanning the page for the answer. Paternity confirmed, probability of relationship 99.9. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Ethan was his son. This part builds on the tension and emotional weight from part 1, deepening Daniel's internal struggle as he uncovers more about Samantha's life and Ethan's existence. The discovery of the unsent letter adds complexity to Samantha's character and Daniel's guilt, while the DNA test builds suspense, culminating in the climactic moment when Daniel learns the truth. This sets up the emotional stakes for the next part, where Daniel will have to navigate the challenges of becoming a father to a boy who has already lost so much. Daniel's office, early morning. The words on the screen, paternity confirmed, probability of relationship. 99.9 stared back at Daniel, the letters sharp and stark against the glowing backdrop. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a long moment he couldn't move. Ethan was his son. All the guilt, the doubts, the swirling uncertainty had finally landed on something concrete. But the knowledge came with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a shaky breath. His life, which had once been governed by deals and profits, was now intertwined with something far more fragile and delicate, a child. His child. Daniel thought of Ethan, a boy who had already lost so much. How would he react to the news? Would he be angry, relieved, indifferent? Their relationship so far had been tentative, filled with unspoken pain and cautious exchanges. But now, there was no going back. Daniel had to be there for Ethan in a way he had never been for anyone before. He couldn't fail him. Not now. Karen Jensen's apartment, afternoon. A few hours later, Daniel found himself standing outside Karen Jensen's apartment, the DNA results clutched in his hand. He hadn't told Ethan yet. He wasn't even sure how to start the conversation. The weight of the news felt like an anvil pressing down on him, and he knew that once he told Ethan, everything would change. Karen opened the door, greeting him with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She gestured for him to come in, her protective nature toward Ethan still palpable. Daniel had called ahead, asking if they could talk, and though Karen had agreed, he could sense her lingering reservations about him. Ethan was sitting on the worn couch in the living room, his notebook in his lap, scribbling absent-mindedly. When he saw Daniel, he looked up, his expression a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "Hey," Daniel said softly, sitting down across from him. His heart raced as he held out the paper. "I have something to tell you. About the test." Ethan's face tightened, his fingers gripping the edges of his notebook a little harder. "What did it say?" he asked, his voice steady but tense. Daniel took a deep breath. "It's positive. You're my son." Ethan blinked, the words hanging in the air between them. For a moment Daniel thought he might lash out, might storm off in anger. But Ethan just sat there, his face a blank canvas. I don't know what to say," Ethan finally murmured, his voice barely audible. "I know this is a lot to take in," Daniel said gently, "and I don't expect you to have all the answers right now. But I want you to know that I'm here. I want to be part of your life, Ethan, in whatever way you'll let me." Ethan stared at the paper in Daniel's hand, his expression unreadable. There was a long silence, thick with uncertainty. Daniel could almost hear the gears turning in the boy's head, processing the information. "I don't know what that means," Ethan said, his voice strained. "What does that even look like? You weren't there before." "Why now?" The question cut through Daniel, sharp and painful. He had been waiting for it. Ethan had every right to ask why Daniel hadn't been there when he needed him most. Daniel had asked himself the same question, over and over, ever since he found out about Samantha's death. "I didn't know," Daniel said quietly. "If I had, I would have been there. I swear." "I'm sorry, Ethan. I really am." Ethan's eyes flickered with something hurt, maybe, or confusion. He set his notebook down and looked away. "I don't know if I can believe that," he muttered. The vulnerability in Ethan's voice tugged at Daniel's heart. He didn't blame the boy for being skeptical, for doubting him. Trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. But Daniel was determined to earn it. "I know I can't change the past," Daniel said softly, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Daniel's penthouse, evening. That night Daniel returned to his penthouse, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, staring out at the glittering city below. The skyline, once a symbol of his success and power, now felt distant, meaningless. He had spent so many years chasing after success, climbing the corporate ladder, and making deals that had filled his bank account but left his soul empty. What had it all been for? Daniel swirled the whiskey in his glass, his mind drifting back to Samantha. He had loved her once, deeply. They had shared a life, a future that had seemed so full of possibility. But then his career had taken over, and he had let her slip away. And now she was gone. Gone without him ever getting the chance to make things right. And Ethan, his son, a boy who had been left to fend for himself, to deal with a grief that no 12-year-old should have to bear. Daniel had missed so many opportunities to be there for him. But now he had a chance to change that. He couldn't undo the past, but he could be there for Ethan now. He had to be. The next morning, Daniel decided. He walked into Morgan Enterprises and called a meeting with his board. He had spent too many years allowing his work to dominate his life, but that was going to change. He would hand over day-to-day operations to his trusted executives, stepping back from the empire he had built to focus on what truly mattered: his relationship with Ethan. As Daniel sat in the conference room, explaining his decision to the board, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in years, he was letting go of the control that had ruled his life. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing. His career had given him everything: money, power, influence, but none of it compared to the chance to be a father. Central Park, Saturday morning. The following weekend, Daniel met Ethan in Central Park. He had asked Ethan if he wanted to spend the day together, and to his surprise, the boy had agreed. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. They walked through the park, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting a soft golden light over the path. Daniel glanced at Ethan, who was walking quietly beside him, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. "I was thinking we could visit some of your mom's favorite spots today," Daniel said, his voice tentative. "Maybe we could talk about her." Ethan didn't respond right away, but eventually he nodded. "Yeah, she loved this park. We used to come here a lot." As they walked, Ethan began to open up about his mother. He told Daniel about the little things she used to do, how she would sing to herself while cooking, how she always made sure to kiss him goodnight, even when she was exhausted. Daniel listened, his heart aching with each story. He could picture Samantha so clearly, could almost hear her voice. The memories were bittersweet, a reminder of what he had lost, but also of the love that had once been so strong. They sat down on a bench near the fountain, the same spot where they had first met. The water shimmered in the sunlight, and for a moment they sat in silence, lost in their thoughts. "She used to bring me here when she needed to think," Ethan said quietly. "I didn't know she was sick. Not until it was too late." Daniel's chest tightened. He had been so caught up in his own life that he hadn't even known Samantha was sick. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. The guilt gnawed at him, but he pushed it down, focusing on Ethan. "I didn't know either," Daniel said softly. "I wish I had." Ethan looked down at his hands, his brow furrowed. "Why didn't she tell you?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wish I could ask her. But I think maybe she didn't think I'd care. Or maybe she thought I was too busy to help." Ethan's eyes filled with sadness. "She never said anything about you." "Not really. Just that you were someone important to her." "I was," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was important to me too. More than I realized. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared grief hanging between them. But in that silence, there was also a sense of connection, a fragile bond that was beginning to take shape. The graveyard, early afternoon. A few weeks later, Daniel and Ethan visited Samantha's grave together for the first time. It was a quiet, overcast day, the sky heavy with clouds. The cemetery was peaceful, the headstones lined up in neat rows, each one a reminder of the lives that had come and gone. Ethan stood in front of his mother's grave, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Daniel stood beside him, giving him space but wanting to be there for him. For a while neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Finally, Ethan's voice broke the stillness. "Why weren't you there?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Why didn't you know? Why didn't you help her?" The questions hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come, but it didn't make it any easier. "I didn't know," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I had. I would have been there if I had known, Ethan. I swear." Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "But you weren't there when she needed you. You weren't there when I needed you." Daniel's heart broke as he watched Ethan's grief spill out, raw and unfiltered. He wanted to fix it, wanted to take away the boy's pain, but he knew he couldn't. All he could do was be there, to offer the comfort he had failed to give in the past. "I know," Daniel said softly, his voice trembling. "I know I wasn't there, and I'm so sorry for that. But I'm here now, Ethan, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you, whatever you need." Ethan didn't respond. He stood there, his body shaking with sobs, and Daniel felt utterly helpless. But then slowly, Ethan took a step toward him, then another. Before Daniel could process what was happening, Ethan wrapped his arms around him, clinging to him as if he were a lifeline. Daniel's heart swelled with emotion as he hugged Ethan tightly, holding him as the boy cried. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the walls between them finally came down. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the pain of the past, but it was a start. Daniel's penthouse. Evening. In the weeks that followed, things began to change between Daniel and Ethan. Their relationship, once fragile and tentative, was slowly becoming something stronger. They spent more time together, talking, laughing, and sharing memories of Samantha. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, times when Ethan would pull back, unsure of how to navigate this new relationship. But Daniel was patient. He knew it would take time. One evening, after dinner, Ethan asked a question that took Daniel by surprise. "What was she like when you were together, I mean?" Daniel smiled, a bittersweet feeling settling in his chest. "She was amazing," he said softly. "Smart, funny, stubborn. She had this way of lighting up a room just by being in it. I loved her a lot." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think she loved you too. She just never said it." Daniel's heart ached, but there was also a sense of peace in hearing those words. He had made mistakes, many of them, but now he had a chance to make things right. And that was more than he ever thought he deserved. Daniel's office, mid-morning. The months following Ethan's emotional breakdown at Samantha's grave were a turning point for both Daniel and Ethan. Their fragile bond, once filled with tension and doubt, was starting to grow stronger. They spent more time together, learning about each other, slowly building trust. But Daniel knew that he couldn't stop there. He needed to do more, not just for Ethan, but for Samantha's memory. As he sat in his office one morning, staring at a blank sheet of paper, an idea began to take shape. He would create something in Samantha's honor, something that would reflect the kindness and strength she had shown throughout her life. The foundation. The idea was simple but powerful: a charitable organization that would support single-parent families, helping those who were struggling the way Samantha had. It would provide financial aid, educational resources, and emotional support for families in need. For Daniel, it was a way to honor Samantha's memory while making a real difference in the world, something beyond the wealth and success he had built for himself. Daniel picked up the phone and called his lawyer, Tom. "I want to start a foundation," Daniel said, his voice steady. "In Samantha's name. Central Park. Late afternoon." As the foundation plan started taking shape, Daniel and Ethan continued to spend time together, finding comfort in each other's presence. On one particularly sunny afternoon, they met at Central Park, their usual spot near the fountain. This time, though, Daniel had brought something with him, a baseball and 2 gloves. He held them up with a grin. "You ever play catch before?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" Daniel shrugged. "Why not let's give it a try?" They walked to an open patch of grass, where Daniel handed Ethan one of the gloves. At first, Ethan seemed hesitant, unsure of how to react. But slowly, as Daniel tossed the ball to him, something changed. The two of them spent the next hour playing catch, laughing when the ball went wild, making jokes about Daniel's less-than-perfect throwing arm. For Daniel, it was a simple but significant moment. This was what he had missed out on, these small, everyday experiences that created the bond between a father and son. As he watched Ethan throw the ball back with growing confidence, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Afterward, they sat on the grass, the sun casting long shadows across the park. Daniel glanced at Ethan, who was staring up at the sky, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know," Ethan said suddenly, "I think she would have liked this, seeing us together." Daniel's heart swelled. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think she would have." Karen Jensen's apartment. Evening. One evening, Daniel received a call from Ethan. The boy's voice was hesitant, almost nervous. "Hey, there's something I want to show you. It's from my mom's stuff." Daniel agreed to meet him at Karen's apartment. When he arrived, Ethan led him to his room, where a small box was sitting on the bed, the same box of keepsakes they had looked through months earlier. But this time, Ethan pulled out something Daniel hadn't seen before: a small folded letter. "I found this last night," Ethan said, handing it to Daniel. "I think she wrote it to you, but she never sent it." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. Samantha's handwriting danced across the page, familiar yet distant. As he read, his heart ached with every word. In the letter, Samantha had written about her regrets, about how she had wanted to reach out to Daniel, to tell him about Ethan, but had been afraid that Daniel wouldn't want to be involved, that he had moved on with his life. She had written about her love for both Daniel and Ethan, about how much she had struggled to raise Ethan alone, but had never given up. Daniel's chest tightened as he finished reading the letter. It was a window into Samantha's heart, into the fears and doubts that had kept her from reaching out to him. He had spent so many years blaming himself for not being there, but now he realized that Samantha had been afraid of the same thing, of being rejected, of not being enough. "I didn't know she felt this way," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan sat beside him, silent but understanding. He didn't need to say anything. The letter spoke for both of them. Morgan Enterprises, boardroom. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to transition away from the day-to-day responsibilities of Morgan Enterprises. His trusted executives took over the operations, allowing him to focus more on his personal life and the foundation he was building with Ethan. The foundation was more than just a tribute to Samantha. It was a way for Daniel to reclaim a part of his life that he had lost. The work was fulfilling in a way that business deals and corporate success had never been. As he sat in meetings with lawyers and philanthropists, discussing the structure and goals of the foundation, Daniel felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. Ethan, too, became more involved. He attended meetings with Daniel, learning about the inner workings of the foundation and offering his own insights. Though still reserved at times, Ethan's confidence was growing. He was finding his voice, finding his place in this new chapter of his life. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting, Ethan turned to Daniel as they left the office. "Do you think we're doing enough?" Ethan asked, his expression serious. Daniel smiled. "I think we're doing a lot, but there's always more we can do." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I want to help more. For her." Daniel's heart swelled with pride. "We will, Ethan. We will." Central Park, early morning. A few months later, Ethan approached Daniel with an idea. He had seen a flyer for a local charity run, an event to raise money for families who had lost a parent or were going through difficult times. The cause hit close to home for both of them, and Ethan suggested that they participate in the run together. Daniel was immediately on board. On the day of the event, Central Park was alive with energy. Hundreds of participants milled around the starting line, wearing shirts with names of loved ones printed across the back. Ethan and Daniel stood among them, each wearing a shirt with Samantha's name emblazoned across it. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of morning that hinted at the change of seasons. Ethan looked up at Daniel as they stretched, his eyes bright with anticipation. "You ready?" Daniel grinned. "I'm ready if you are." As they ran side by side, the park blurred around them. The rhythmic pounding of their feet on the pavement, the sound of their breathing, the rush of the cool wind, it all felt cathartic. With every step, Daniel felt closer to Ethan, closer to Samantha. This wasn't just a charity run, it was a tribute to the woman who had brought them together, even in her absence. When they crossed the finish line, Ethan was panting, his face flushed but glowing with pride. He turned to Daniel, a wide smile on his face. "We did it." Daniel smiled back, his chest tight with emotion. "Yeah, we did." After the run, they visited Samantha's grave, as had become their ritual. They stood in silence for a few moments, letting the quiet settle over them. "I think she'd be proud of us," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know she would." Daniel's penthouse, evening. Life for Daniel and Ethan slowly began to take on a new rhythm. The foundation grew, attracting attention from donors and community leaders. Daniel found himself more invested in the work than he had ever been in his corporate life. But more than that, he was invested in his relationship with Ethan. The boy who had once been a stranger was now a constant presence in his life. They shared meals, watched movies, and even started attending therapy sessions together, working through the grief and unresolved emotions that still lingered. There were still challenges, still moments when Ethan would retreat into himself, but those moments were becoming fewer. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Ethan turned to Daniel with a question that caught him off guard. "Do you think she's watching us, like, from wherever she is?" Daniel paused, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't expected such a heavy question, but he knew how important it was to Ethan. "I think so," Daniel said quietly. "I think she's with us in her own way. And I think she's proud of you." Ethan didn't say anything, but the small smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth spoke volumes. The Foundation's first gala, nighttime. A year later, the Foundation hosted its first official gala, a fundraising event that drew hundreds of people from across the city. The event was held in a grand ballroom, the tables decorated with white linens and floral arrangements. A large banner hung above the stage. The Samantha Morgan Foundation, supporting single-parent families and children in need. Daniel stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Beside him, Ethan was dressed in a sharp suit, his posture more confident than Daniel had ever seen. He watched as Ethan interacted with the guests, explaining the mission of the foundation with a passion that made Daniel's heart swell with pride. As the evening progressed, the two of them stood together at the center of the ballroom, watching the guests mingle, watching the impact they had created together. "We did it," Ethan said, echoing the words he had spoken after the charity run. Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "We did." In that moment, Daniel realized how far they had come. What had started as a chance meeting in the park had grown into something far greater than he ever could have imagined. He had found not only a son but a purpose. The foundation was thriving, and so was their relationship. The pain of losing Samantha would never fully go away, but they had found a way to honor her memory and move forward together. They had become a family forged through loss, love, and the determination to make something meaningful out of the tragedy that had once torn them apart. As the night drew to a close, Daniel and Ethan stepped outside onto the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against their faces. The city skyline twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the life Daniel had once thought was everything. But now, as he stood beside his son, he realized that this moment, this life, was what truly mattered. "I'm proud of you," Daniel said softly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with the quiet strength that Daniel had come to admire so much. "I'm proud of you too." And in that moment, Daniel knew that they were going to be okay. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because they were no longer just two people bound by the past, They were a family, and that was enough. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey through the distance between us. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more heartfelt tales of love, loss, and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss out on the next chapter or story I share. Also, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Daniel and Ethan's journey and what you'd like to see next. See you in the next one.
You deserve to have family, Tyler. And if there's even a small part of you that wants to know him better, I think it's worth trying. Tyler stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Daniel's face for something, maybe reassurance, maybe trust. Then slowly he nodded. Okay, Tyler said, his voice barely audible. You'll give him a chance. The first meeting between Tyler and Richard was awkward, to say the least. They had agreed to meet at a neutral place, a quiet park, on the outskirts of the city, where they could talk without any pressure. Daniel had brought Tyler, but he kept his distance, letting the two of them navigate this delicate reunion on their own terms. Tyler stood by the swings, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, while Richard approached with slow, cautious steps. The older man looked nervous, something Daniel hadn't seen in Richard before. He was always so composed, so sure of himself. But now, as he stood before his nephew, he looked almost fragile. Tyler, Richard said softly, his voice filled with hesitation. Tyler glanced at him, then looked away, kicking at the dirt beneath his feet. Hi. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Richard took another step forward, stopping a few feet away from Tyler. I'm glad you came, he said, his voice tentative. I know I've let you down, more than once, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm hoping we can start over. Tyler's jaw tightened, but he didn't walk away. He stood there, silent, listening, his body language stiff and uncomfortable. I've thought about your mom a lot, Richard continued, his voice growing heavier with emotion. She would have wanted us to be a family, and I failed her in that. I failed you. But I want to make it right. For the first time, Tyler turned to face his uncle, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. Why now, he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Why do you care now, when you didn't care before? Richard's face crumpled, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Because I didn't know how, he admitted, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to be there for you. And by the time I realized how much I had let you down, it felt like it was too late. Tyler swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the ground again. I don't know if I can trust you. I understand, Richard said softly, and I'm not asking you to trust me right away. But I'm asking you to let me try. There was a long, painful silence before Tyler finally nodded. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Over the next few months, Richard slowly became a part of Tyler's life. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, moments when Tyler's old wounds resurfaced, but they were making progress. Richard attended some of Tyler's baseball games. They went out for lunch a few times, and though their relationship was far from perfect, it was growing. Through it all, Daniel remained a steady presence in Tyler's life. He was still the one Tyler came home to, still the one who helped with homework, who played catch in the park, who made sure Tyler had everything he needed. And for Daniel, that was enough. He had never expected to be a father figure, but now that he was, it felt right. His career, once the most important thing in his life, had taken a back seat to something far more meaningful. He still worked, still won cases, but his heart wasn't in it the way it used to be. Now his heart was with Tyler. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Tyler turned to Daniel with a rare, quiet smile. Thanks, Tyler said, his voice soft. For what, Daniel asked, raising an eyebrow. For everything, Tyler replied. For being here. For not giving up on me. Daniel's chest tightened with emotion. He had spent so many years focused on winning, on success, on being the best. But now, as he looked at Tyler, this boy who had come into his life and changed everything, he realized that true success wasn't about money or power. It was about love, connection, and making a difference in someone's life. And in that moment, Daniel knew that he had finally found the success he had been searching for all along. The years passed, and Daniel watched with pride as Tyler grew into a confident, capable young man. He excelled in school, became a star player on his baseball team, and formed friendships that would last a lifetime. He still had his moments of doubt, his moments of struggle, but with Daniel's guidance and Richard's support, he knew he had a family that would always be there for him. Daniel, too, had changed. He continued to work as a lawyer, but his focus had shifted. He took on more pro bono cases, helping families and children in need, using his skills to make a real difference in the world. And with Tyler by his side, he found a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything he had ever achieved in the courtroom. In the end, Daniel realized that the true measure of success wasn't in the cases he won or the money he made. It was in the lives he touched, the relationships he built, and the love he gave. And as he stood on the porch, watching Tyler and his friends play baseball in the yard, Daniel knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: a family. 5 years had passed since Daniel became Tyler's legal guardian. In those 5 years, both their lives had changed in ways they could never have predicted. Daniel, who had once lived for the thrill of winning high-stakes cases, now found his greatest joys in the smaller, quieter moments that involved Tyler and the life they had built together. It was the end of summer, and Daniel stood on the porch of their suburban home, watching as Tyler, now 17, practiced throwing a baseball with a couple of friends from his high school team. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard, and the sounds of laughter filled the air as the boys tossed the ball back and forth. As Daniel watched, he couldn't help but smile. Tyler had grown into a confident, well-adjusted young man. The shy, angry boy who had once stood at his office door looking for help was now a star pitcher on the high school baseball team, his natural talent nurtured over years of practice. More importantly, Tyler was happy, and that to Daniel was the greatest achievement of all. The back door opened, and Julia stepped out onto the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade. Julia had been by Daniel's side for years, and in the past few years, their relationship had deepened into something more meaningful. She had been a rock for Daniel during his transition to fatherhood, and slowly, over time, their professional relationship had blossomed into a romantic one. She handed him a glass, smiling as she watched the boys in the yard. "He's really come a long way," she said softly. Daniel nodded, a sense of pride welling up in his chest. "He has. I can't believe he's almost done with high school." "He's going to do great things," Julia said, her eyes full of warmth. "And he's lucky to have you." Daniel took a sip of his lemonade, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life he now had. He had spent so many years focused on himself, on his career, his goals, his success, but Tyler had changed all of that. Tyler had shown him what truly mattered. As they stood there together, watching Tyler with his friends, Daniel realized just how far they had all come. They had created something special, something Daniel had never thought he wanted, but now couldn't imagine living without. The next year passed in a whirlwind of activity. Tyler's senior year of high school was filled with all the usual milestones: prom, graduation, and a flurry of college applications. It was a busy time, but through it all, Daniel remained a steady presence, offering guidance and support as Tyler navigated the challenges of growing up. On the day of Tyler's graduation, the entire family gathered in the auditorium: Daniel, Julia, and even Richard, who had become a welcome part of Tyler's life. The tension between Daniel and Richard had long since eased, and though their relationship was still more professional than personal, they had come to an understanding. Richard, for his part, had worked hard to rebuild his connection with Tyler, and while their relationship wasn't perfect, it was strong enough to endure. As the ceremony began, Daniel sat in the audience, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Tyler walk across the stage to receive his diploma. He had come so far from a boy who had felt abandoned and unwanted, to a young man who had worked hard to overcome the obstacles in his path. When the principal announced Tyler's name, the auditorium erupted into applause, and Daniel found himself standing alongside Julia and Richard, cheering for the boy they had all come to love. Tyler accepted his diploma with a wide grin, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Daniel. In that moment, their eyes met, and Daniel saw the gratitude and love reflected in Tyler's gaze. After the ceremony, they gathered outside in the sunshine, posing for pictures and sharing stories of the past few years. Tyler stood tall in his cap and gown, laughing with his friends and basking in the glow of his accomplishment. But when the crowd began to thin out, he made his way over to Daniel, who stood a little off to the side, watching proudly. "Thanks," Tyler said, his voice quiet but sincere. For what, Daniel asked, though he already knew. "For everything," Tyler replied. "For always being there. For not giving up on me." Daniel smiled, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Tyler. More than you'll ever know." Tyler's smile widened, and for a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. After graduation, Tyler decided to attend a local college, choosing to stay close to home while pursuing a degree in sports medicine. He had always loved baseball, but over time, he had developed an interest in the mechanics of the game, the science behind how athletes moved and trained. It was a career path that excited him, and Daniel was thrilled to see Tyler pursuing something he was passionate about. In the months that followed, their relationship continued to grow and evolve. Tyler was becoming more independent, and while Daniel sometimes missed the days when he was needed more, he was proud of the young man Tyler was becoming. There was still a bond between them that was unbreakable, built on years of trust, love, and shared experiences. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Tyler working on a college assignment, and Daniel reviewing legal documents, Tyler looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever miss it?" Tyler asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Daniel glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Miss what?" "Your old life," Tyler clarified. "You know, before me." Daniel set down his pen, considering the question. "I don't," he said honestly. "My life before you. It was empty. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was missing something important." Tyler nodded, his gaze dropping back to his textbook. "I guess I always thought I was the one who needed you. But maybe we needed each other." Daniel's chest tightened at the boy's words. It was true, he had spent so many years building walls around himself, avoiding emotional connections, but Tyler had forced him to break those walls down. In doing so, Daniel had found something far more meaningful than success or money. He had found a family. "You're right," Daniel said softly. "We did." Years later, on a warm summer day, Daniel found himself standing on the sidelines of a local baseball field, watching as Tyler, now an assistant coach for a youth baseball team, worked with a group of young players. Tyler had found his place in the world, combining his love for sports with his desire to help others. And Daniel couldn't have been prouder. As he watched Tyler move across the field, offering guidance and encouragement to the kids, Daniel realized just how far they had both come. The boy who had once been lost, angry, and alone was now a mentor to others, helping them find their way just as Daniel had helped him. Julia stood beside Daniel, her hand resting on his arm as they watched the game together. They had been married for 2 years now, and though their relationship had started in the professional realm, it had grown into something deep and enduring. Together, they had built a life that was full of love, laughter, and meaning. "You know," Julia said, her voice soft but teasing, "you've come a long way since those days in the office." Daniel chuckled, nodding. "Yeah, I have." He thought back to the man he used to be, the man who cared only about his career, who kept everyone at arm's length. That version of himself felt like a distant memory now, a shadow of the man he had become. As the game ended, Tyler jogged over to them, a wide grin on his face. "We won," he said, his voice full of excitement. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course you did." They gathered their things and headed to the car, laughing and chatting about the game. As they walked, Daniel felt a deep sense of contentment, a feeling that had eluded him for so long but was now ever present in his life. He had found what he had been searching for all along, not in the courtroom, not in power or success, but in the family he had built, the love he had given and received, and the difference he had made in the lives of those around him. And as they drove away, the sound of Tyler's laughter filling the car, Daniel knew that this was the life he had always wanted, even if he hadn't known it at the time. He had found his purpose. He had found his family. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey with Daniel and Tyler. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more heartwarming tales like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Daniel's transformation and Tyler's path to healing? Drop a comment below and let us know. Don't forget to like and share this story with friends who might enjoy it too. Together, we can spread more love and inspiration. But as people stopped to admire her paintings, offering compliments, and asking about her process, she felt a sense of validation she hadn't expected. One of the visitors to the exhibit was Professor Reynolds, the board member who had supported the changes at Brookwood. He paused in front of one of Chloe's paintings, studying it carefully. "This is remarkable," he said, turning to Chloe with a smile. "You have a real talent." Chloe blushed, feeling both proud and shy at the same time. "Thank you. It means a lot." As the evening went on, Chloe realized that she had found her place not just as a student at Brookwood, but as an artist with a voice of her own. The Carter family had been through a storm, but they had come out stronger on the other side. With the lawsuit behind them and Brookwood Academy on a new path, they were ready to focus on what mattered most to each other. One summer evening, the family gathered in their backyard for a barbecue, a tradition they had started before the chaos of the lawsuit had consumed their lives. The smell of grilled food filled the air as they laughed and talked, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. Jasmine and Chloe sat on the patio, reminiscing about their first day at Brookwood and how much had changed since then. "I never thought we'd get through all of that," Jasmine said, sipping lemonade. "But here we are." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad we didn't give up. It was hard, but we made it." Ethan joined them, holding a plate of burgers and hot dogs. He smiled at his daughters, pride radiating from him. "You two are the strongest people I know. You fought for what was right, and you made a difference." Vanessa, carrying a bowl of salad, sat down beside Ethan. She placed a hand on his arm, her expression filled with love and gratitude. "We all made a difference, and we did it together." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, the Carters sat around the table eating and laughing. The weight of the past year finally lifted. They knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. That night, as Jasmine and Chloe sat outside, looking up at the stars, they reflected on how far they had come. They had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of their place in the world. "I think we're going to be okay," Chloe said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. Jasmine smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, we're going to be just fine." Months after the lawsuit had ended, the Carter family continued to move forward, both personally and professionally. Ethan's proposed bill on educational reform was gaining momentum in Congress, with support from lawmakers across the political spectrum. The bill aimed to establish nationwide guidelines for private school admissions, ensuring that no student would be discriminated against based on race, socioeconomic status, or background. On the day of the vote, Ethan stood in the Senate chamber, addressing his colleagues with the same passion that had driven him throughout the Brookwood case. "This bill is about fairness," he said, his voice steady but powerful. "It's about giving every child a fair shot at success. It's about ensuring that no student is ever told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. We've come a long way, but we still have work to do. And it starts here, with this bill." As the vote was cast, the bill passed with overwhelming support, marking a major victory in the fight for educational equity. Ethan, standing in the Senate chamber, allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The fight was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued to work on cases related to racial discrimination, using her platform to advocate for families facing similar challenges. She became a mentor to young lawyers, sharing her knowledge and experience to help them navigate the complexities of civil rights law. For Jasmine and Chloe, life at Brookwood had settled into a new normal. They continued to thrive academically, but they also made time for the things they loved: debating, painting, and building friendships with students from all walks of life. One afternoon, as the sisters sat in the school library, Chloe looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at Jasmine. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Chloe asked. Jasmine thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't like to think about that. What matters is that we did fight. And because of that, everything changed." Chloe nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We should be proud of that." "We are," Jasmine said, her voice filled with certainty. "We made a difference." As the sisters packed up their things and headed out of the library, they knew that their fight had been worth it. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, and they had helped pave the way for a future where every student, regardless of race or background, could walk through the doors of opportunity with their head held high. The road ahead was long, but the Carters were ready for it. Thank you so much for following the Carter family's journey to justice and equality. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about powerful narratives that challenge society, inspire change, and explore the human experience, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on new content. Together, we can continue to share stories that matter. See you in the next one. The police are on their way, Derek. You've lost. Derek's eyes darted around, realizing for the first time that the entire street was watching him. His bravado faltered, his shoulders tensing as he took in the growing crowd of neighbors, all standing together in a show of solidarity. For a moment, it seemed like Derek might lash out, might do something reckless. But then slowly, the fight drained out of him. His fists unclenched, his shoulders slumped, and with one last look at Edith filled with hatred and resentment, he turned and stormed back to his car. The street was silent as Derek sped away, his tires screeching against the pavement. Edith's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She stood there for a moment, frozen, until Bill crossed the street and stood beside her. "You okay, Edith?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Edith nodded, though her legs still felt shaky. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to all of you." Bill smiled warmly, giving her a reassuring nod. "We're not going to let him hurt you, Edith. Not now, not ever." Edith's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of gratitude. She had been afraid for so long, but now, standing here with her neighbors by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone. In the days following the final confrontation with Derek, the neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the sense of fear that had once gripped Cedar Street began to dissipate. Derek hadn't returned, and Edith had received word from the police that he was being closely monitored. They had issued a restraining order, preventing Derek from coming within a certain distance of Edith's home or the shelter where Rachel and the girls were staying. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give Edith peace of mind for now. Rachel called regularly, checking in to see how Edith was doing and updating her on their progress. The shelter had helped her find legal representation, and she was working towards securing full custody of the girls and filing for divorce from Derek. It was a long, difficult road, but Rachel was determined to keep moving forward. "The girls are adjusting," Rachel said during one phone call, her voice sounding stronger, more confident. "They're starting to sleep better, and we're getting used to our new routine. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free." Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbor's son's strangers had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith. Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She too had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better, richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Mom made hot chocolate." Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.